Ranking the Scene.
Yo, what the fuck is up, Warped Tour? The state of the scene at SOTS Podcast on all social media. Sam here with Marcos.
What's good?
These albums, maybe.
Oh,
we'll find out.
I guess so.
Right? We're going to get there through our discussion. So, for those of you unfamiliar,
They're familiar by now.
this is Ranking the Scene. No, they're not. They might not be. You don't know that. All right? Let me give the pitch.
What is it?
Every week, we bring 3 new albums to an ever-growing tier list and rank them against every album that's come before and every album that'll come after to figure out the best album in the scene and, coincidentally, the worst. This week, we have the debut album from Dangerkids, Collapse, No Time to Bleed by Suicide Silence, and Disgusting by Beartooth, also a debut, as a matter of fact.
It is, and it's also the second time that we've done Beartooth on Ranking the Scene. We're returning to the well.
The audience was hungry for more Beartooth, and we wanted to feed them. Like a mama
pack of
bird
ravenous bears that they are.
crushing a worm in its mouth and regurgitating it into its begging children. That's us.
I don't know if you can crush a worm just based on like
Try me.
the biology of it.
Yeah, you can crush a worm. Absolutely.
No, you can like squish a worm. There's not much like when you say crush, I think like crunch. And there's nothing to crunch.
because it has no bones.
You're squishing it. Yeah.
I'm not going to argue with that on this one. I think you may be correct. These albums were suggested to us by our patrons. If you want to suggest an album for Ranking the Scene, patreon.com/SOTS podcast for only $3 a month. Marcus, the prompt for this week was the same as last week. What are albums that remind you of Warped Tour? A couple of these actually connect for me. Last week, none of those bands were bands that I ever caught at Warped Tour. They weren't albums that I ever heard at Warped Tour. But these, like Disgusting, like I remember that album coming out like 6 weeks before I saw this band play Warped Tour.
Yeah. But
So there's we're in a lot like in alignment, us and the patrons this week.
But we never saw Suicide Silence.
That's
on
true.
Warped. That's also not a band,
Which is a shame, actually.
regardless of how many times they played Warped, that really they don't live there in my mind.
Right, because you never caught them. It's got to be a band you caught. Before we scroll up, I don't think spoilers really matter on the show, but if you don't want to know where everything sits so far, you can go check out our playlist on our YouTube channel for Ranking the Scene and watch chronologically so you can see how we got here. Real quick, your tiers. Starting at the top, GOAT, followed by Masterpiece, Certified Hood Classic, That Bitch, Just Okay, Pretty Mid, Fucking Awful, and finally, A Crime to Humanity, which is where Green Day's Father of All sits alone all by its lonesome as the worst album we've ever listened to, Marcus. And at the very top, the best album we've heard to date, Sempiternal by Bring Me the Horizon, followed closely by Disposed by The Plot and You, and Self-Titled by Escape the Fate. I had like a moment there where I was like, is that self-titled? It's not. It's not self-titled. It's, hold on. It's late. It's late.
We might have to reconsider where it places.
I'm a little fried. It's late. We're talking about
Dying
is your latest fashion.
Yes.
Thank you. An album that I quite enjoy, but don't hold it against me. I had a momentary lapse of memory.
Personally, I might.
I had a black hole in my mind.
Let's
Marcos,
talk about fucking Dangerkids, bro.
like I said earlier, their debut album released September 16th, 2013, over a decade ago.
That makes me feel pretty icky.
As you should. You should feel the ick.
Dangerkids were like... They were the freshman class after like 2013. We got introduced to like Color Morale, Memphis Mayfire, and like the next freshman class, like Upon a Burning Body, For me, like Dangerkids was
Yeah.
one of them.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason in my mind, that still means that this band is fresh and new.
I think there's also something about this band breaking up after their second album that has sort of kept them fresh and new feeling.
Yeah.
But you're saying you feel like you discovered this band, but it turns out that was over 11 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, you discovered a new band that is now ancient in terms of music.
Who, because I have to guess that many people aren't extremely familiar with Dangerkids. Who are Dangerkids, and what might one of the members today do?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, the member of Dangerkids who I think has retained the most prominence within the scene is Tyler Smith, who is now a producer.
Known as Myth.
Myth, yes, thank you. Who is credited with working like with artists like Falling in Reverse and Lights.
Yeah.
They are
Big names in their own rights.
well renowned as a producer at this point, which is, for me, I think, a really incredible way to land.
Well,
And I'm glad that we
It's-
still have a piece of this band existing in the scene.
yeah, but I guess the reason I wanted to bring that up is I saw the potential when I first listened to Collapse.
I hear the potential in revisiting this
Yeah,
album.
right?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And then like you tell me that this main like songwriter in the band turned around and is now responsible for being one of the biggest producers really in our scene at this time. Then like yeah, there's a timeline of events where like I could have totally seen that play out the way it did.
Yeah.
And here we are. And again, rewind 10 years ago, here we are with Collapse. Sam, you listened to it probably the day it came out. How do you feel about it 10, 11 years removed?
I got to be honest with you. This album held up incredibly well in a way that I did not anticipate. I remember, like, I was thinking back on this record and I'm like, I remember it sounding like Linkin Park playing metalcore, right? Which I still think it very much is. I just thought that there was a lot of fat on this record that it turns out in revisiting it is not there. It's actually much leaner than I thought it was.
Yeah, this was a satisfying revisit. Reaffirmed all of the reasons why I remember liking this band. Reminded me that not only do they exist, but that I probably should have added 3 or 4 of these tracks to a playlist that I then would spend time with to this day.
You felt as if you'd underappreciated this to this point.
Yeah, this is one of like the few bands that I at some point was enamored with that pretty much completely fell off my radar.
I think how strong the production on this is has helped it stand the test of time, which again speaks to the, though I'm not positive if he actually had any, and it was produced by Myth. Yeah. He self-produced. Okay. Yeah. No, that all checks out. Yeah. Okay. This makes so much sense now. I think that the only aspect of this. Okay. So let's talk about how this album starts. Countdown into Light Escapes is huge. It's huge. This band does such an incredible job of using electronics to really take every moment and like triple it in size. Everything hits so much harder. It's so much more exciting. I understand why I was so enamored with this band when I first came upon them, because they really wrote a record to speak directly to my soul. It was everything I wanted at the time. And I think they did it incredibly well here. And I think they managed to take the Linkin Park of it all and not feel like a cringe knockoff that I think a lot of other bands did feel like around this time or even today.
I guess that's the piece that I want to explore with you, because you said that this is everything you wanted at the time. My question to you is, did it deliver something that you really liked, or was it that you were looking for...
The style was everything that I wanted at the time.
Right, but I'm saying like, but you didn't know that you wanted specifically heavier Linkin Park.
No, what I mean to say is that what I wanted was the electronic element melded with metalcore. That was very much what we're a year removed from getting like New Demons, which for me is like by Icy Stars, which is the peak of this sort of integration of electronics into metalcore.
Sure.
The only aspect of this album, okay, so going back and listening to this, what I was thinking about a lot is, do I think that this band could be held in the same regard as Linkin Park in any capacity? And I think the only thing that this album is really missing is like a runaway hit. Like, it just needed a Crawling or an In the End or a Numb for it to be larger than, I think if it had had that one song, it really would have been larger than life. Ultimately, it ends up being a good album that, because it never really has that standout single, never accelerates past like its ceiling.
Yes and no. I think where I come into this album at is this band was so close, and it's not the exact same style by any means. And there are different talents contained within each band, but this band was so close to being I Prevail before I Prevail was I Prevail.
That's an interesting observation. Just in terms of like the sort of rap rock style of it all, the
reach
incredible
that they could have had.
Yeah. Like if a couple other things had fallen in line for them, if they'd had the one or two songs that really broke through, it could have been there.
Yeah.
I think that my favorite part of this album is Where the Sky Breaks and Paper Thin. I think for me, that's almost exactly where this album should have ended, or we should have shuffled the track listing so that is how the album ended.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Paper Thin, the first taste that we ever got of this band?
It was definitely a single, yes.
Yeah. And for me, that stands out as still the biggest and best song off of this record. But like you said, not as much fat on this one as I remember.
And it was a little heavier than I remembered it being as
little
well,
bit.
which I appreciated. I just think that like there's such a
Even-
peak at like Paper Thin that like, I think even though I really like Cut Me Out, I think Fractions and Dust kind of like live in its shadow heavily.
It was, yes, it was everything I remembered it was and nothing at all how I remembered it, if it makes any sense.
100%.
Because what I mean by that is it's way more electronic-y than I remember it, while remembering it was electronic.
Mm-hmm.
It had way more rap in it than I remember, while remembering that this is essentially Shinoda-core.
Right.
Way heavier than I remember it being, while also remembering that it obviously had plenty of heavy bits. Those are like the three main components. That's what makes this up. But like, I remembered them all at different levels, and it turns out it was just like 8 across the board or something, you know, like, I don't know. I thought that was pretty interesting coming into it.
So all that being said, how did you feel overall?
I think the discussion with this one has to start around just okay. And I can't see it obviously coming in any lower. I enjoyed this album much more than anything in Pretty Mid.
Yeah, the consistency of what we hear across this album really helps its case.
And then it's probably landing between that bitch and just okay. I just don't know where.
So you're saying higher end of just okay at the very least?
No. I'm saying those are the two tiers that I could feasibly see it in, because I don't see it in the last 3. I don't see it in the top 3. Do you agree?
I think this hovers in terms of quality right around that At the Skylines album for me.
Similar bands. And well, not really, but yes, electronically.
Similar in terms of my enjoyment of those records.
Also debuts.
But without maybe an all-out hit like I would say that Wage War record has.
I think I would take it right behind At the Skylines then.
But you enjoy it more than Miss May I?
Yes. That looks right.
I'm happy with that if you are.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot more to discuss there. I think that it's one of the albums on here, similar to At the Skylines, where I feel like probably a lot of this audience may not have heard it. And it's one of the albums I would, again, even though it's just landing and just okay, it's still an album I would really, really recommend people go listen to.
Yeah, I would encourage people to check it out as well. Obviously, at the very least, by our placement. I wonder if we can start to say, hey, Just Okay are albums we recommend to check out and everything else is skippable.
Right.
Is an interesting way to start framing this. Marcos?
Anything beneath Just Okay is a skip.
Let's talk about No Time to Bleed by Suicide Silence, released June 30th, 2009.
I remember in 2009, sorry, before we get into a lot of the detail around this album.
Go ahead.
Seeing the name of this band, seeing the album art for this, and thinking, wow, that's not for me. That's too heavy. I just know it. And then listening to it today and like, yeah, I mean, I'm gonna like, you know, write a couple emails out to this one today.
Okay.
And like my stomach's not gonna it's not gonna give me a tummy ache or anything.
Sure, I understand.
It's crazy how time passes.
You've grown enough that you can listen to Suicide Silence.
I just wanted to mention that. Like that's some pretty fucking hardcore artwork.
You want to hear something funny?
Someone all bloody grabbing the curtains. It's scary.
This album has the first Suicide Silence song that I ever heard.
Which is?
And Then She Bled.
So.
Which is a complete misnomer for what this band or misdirect for what this band would sound like.
So the reason why I knew of Suicide Silence, I knew of this album, was because I pretty much just transferred all of your music off iTunes onto my iPod. And every time that would come on and it would start, I'm like, oh, it's too heavy for me. Sam's going down a path I can't follow. So I'd never actually heard And Then She Bled. And I remember like offhandedly you had told me like, yeah, whatever, it's just like an instrumental, but to me that meant like it's gonna be the heaviest instrumental you've ever fucking heard in your life.
Sure.
And actually turns out it fucking was, but for like so many different reasons than I expected. So Sam, when I finally listened to it, it was extremely affecting in an extremely surprising way. And I guess that is where we're starting here. And Then She Bled is one of the most fascinating songs I think we've ever gotten in this scene.
Yeah.
And it's due in part to a couple reasons. It's the boldness of essentially doing it. For those who don't know, No Time to Bleed is a song that it's instrumental, right? But it overlays a 911 phone call a lady made from Stamford, Connecticut. She had a pet chimpanzee who got out of the house one day, and as they were trying to get this chimpanzee, I believe its name was Travis, back in the house, her friend, I believe her name was Nora, tried to get the chimpanzee's attention with one of its favorite toys, a Tickle Me Elmo. And for some reason, apparently that just set something off in its brain and it went into attack mode and it started mauling this person and ended up blinding her. There were teeth from the chimpanzee lodged in this woman's like bones. Mulder took off 9 fingers. Extremely, extremely disturbing story. So while I'm listening to this song, I don't have any of this context, and I'm putting all of this together. And one of the more interesting things about that 911 phone call is that the reporter or the agent, the dispatcher, thought it was a hoax the entire time.
Is that why it feels like in some capacity they are not taking the situation as seriously as you'd hope
for
they
like
would?
the first minute or so? And then at some point, the lady, the owner of the chimpanzee, who's her pet, starts saying that the chimpanzee is eating her friend. And like something clicks for the dispatcher and he's like, oh shit, this is fucking real. But yeah, listening to this, and I guess like that's where I'll sort of end. For those who don't know, like this is also the lady that survived all this, went on to get interviewed like 10 months later by like Oprah and unveiled like the damage that was done to her for the whole entire world to see. Because this is 2009 Oprah. This is like the biggest stage in television you could have at that point. Really weird interview, by the way. I watched some of it. I was so fascinated with everything. I learned all of this fucking today.
I'm
after
literally
listening
learning
to
this in
song.
person as you're telling me this. I didn't know any of this context for a song that I've adored for years.
This song was so affecting that like my entire day paused around it as I'm sort of putting together what it is. And then I'm sitting there, like I said earlier, like the fucking audacity of this band to make it a song. Because that's what's so affecting about it. It's like, it's not that the band made this a very emotional experience. It's that at face value, that is one of the most disturbing audio clips like that I've ever heard. Because you can also hear the chimpanzee at the beginning, like yelling in the background. Because she's like locked in her car and he's like clearly mauling her friend to death almost. And yeah, that it was extremely effective. And by the time you finish that song, you just sort of sit there and there's just like this fucking undeniable weight to it. And that's why for me, it's honestly the type of song I really am happy to have heard and happy that we do ranking the scene for, because who knows how long I could have gone without hearing that.
Was this your first time hearing this song?
I think it was, because like I said, because I had downloaded it even though it was on your iTunes, and I'm sitting there like, again, like not quite my speed. Right. So every time it would come up on shuffle, I'm just like, because it doesn't get started right away, and like as it begins, it just kind of feels like what every other band does, which is just like, this is all fake, whatever. Like, we were just like, this is ambient sounds, and then it's like...
Quick aside, the instrumentals to this is also fucking incredible.
Yeah, I'm not trying to like be that disparaging, but like everything else about what this is and how it is and all that is so much more interesting to me.
It's such a weird stroke of brilliance in so many different levels, but it is incredible to me that had you not sat here and provided all this context, I would have continued to think that it was something just taken from a horror movie that they had layered an instrumental over.
Also, that entire event directly inspires a lot of the imagery and a lot of the idea, I guess, from the chimpanzee scenes in Nope.
Right, but obviously that's a movie that came out 10 years after this album. Or more than 10 years after this album.
More. Yeah. Well, that was 2009, by the way, that chimpanzee attack. February. The turnaround time for this band by June to already have a song constructed around it and physically released on an album.
Insane.
Crazy.
So the rest of the album is nothing like that.
Not at all. Also, none of this band's future or past material, anything like that.
All right.
Also, why did this song make the cut for you? Back in the day, I mean, like, why was this the only...
Because it was the first one I heard, and I loved it.
But I am assuming that it took all the way until...
This was introduced to me by, like...
May 2024 for this to be an album you had heard in full.
No, I had heard this album in full prior.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you remember, but at one point, it wasn't the last Suicide Silence album. Maybe... It might have been Doris, honestly. I did like a discography run for Suicide Silence to like get prepared, because I had always been curious about those albums that I hadn't heard prior. So with all that being said, Marcos, so I wouldn't say that I was spooky scared of this band when I was younger, but they never fully connected with me. Like, this was the only song that ever really fully connected with me until probably a few years later, where I think around the time of Mitch's passing, if not exactly the time of Mitch's passing. So Mitch Luger, the vocalist for this band on this album, who like tragically passed away, I remember listening to You Only Live Once and being like, well, actually, this song is kind of incredible. And then obviously years later, I would go back and revisit all of these albums. So this one was slightly fresher in my memory than most, and that I'd probably heard it in the last few years. But Suicide Silence has always been a band that has never fully clicked for me, and I'm not entirely sure why. It's like I can appreciate the talent and the technicality of everything that's happening here, but I don't think it's one of... Suicide Silence has never been one of these metalcore bands or deathcore bands that have been interested in meeting their listeners halfway, and sort of like providing a lot of like the melodies or the little small touches that like are probably the reasons that I connected more with a lot of heavier bands that were willing to kind of throw me a bone in some capacity, you know? So like while I was comfortable listening to Chelsea Grin because there were certain aspects of like their breakdowns or some type of hook that I could like attach myself to, Suicide Silence never really made any effort to do those things, right? They leaned heavily into the fact that they were kind of a sort of style of off-puttingly heavy deathcore.
Yeah.
And I still kind of feel the same way about them, even go back and listen to this album again, which is that I appreciate a lot of it, but I find myself not being able to connect with it, even all these years later, where I am much more amicable to heavier music in general, where like something like a new like End or Psycho Frame is like, yeah, this is kind of disgustingly heavy and it doesn't really provide a lot of like melody in any sort of style or like something to pull me in outside of it just being really heavy, but I do find a lot to like in it. And I've still always had that trouble with Suicide Silence.
I don't know if I can echo your thoughts here, and I don't know if part of it's just at this point having a good understanding of what Suicide Silence is and knowing that, especially in the Mitch days, that like what we got is what we have, right? So like no changing that. No, obviously nowadays there's no thinking it's going to be any different. I ultimately enjoy this album for what it is, while also acknowledging, like you, that yeah, it's not my preferred style of deathcore, but like
it's a band I've always wanted to love more than I do.
Yeah. I mean, that said, pleasantly surprised by this one. I had a fairly good time. It's not all good. It kind of loses me in the back half after, and then she bled, but I think a part of it is...
Wake Up and Lifted, I'm like really kind of on this band's wavelength, and I think that after that, I'm never so fully invested until we get to And Then She Bled, which I still think is like, again, a pure work of art.
So the only problem with And Then She Bled is where it sits on the album.
It is a weird hard stop in the middle of this record.
Well, the trouble I have with it is so distractingly what it is that I can then not focus on Wasted.
Interesting.
I cannot focus on Your Creations. And then by the time that like that focus, like I've snapped back, Genocide is fine.
Disengage has got to pull you in a little bit more. Yeah, okay.
And you know, it's decent, right? But like leading up, like those first 6 tracks before we get And Then She Bled, I'm really feeling it. I'm not gonna lie. Like No Time to Bleed, the cover track, the title track on here, ends up really being my second favorite track on this album. I just sort of like, I love what it turns into at the end, the repetition. Sometimes I like when this band beats you over the head with things over and over again. It's not all great though. I will give you that. So let's look at this tier list. And I'm going to hit you with something weird in that And Then She Bled is such a fucking masterpiece that this is probably clearing pretty mid off the strength of one song.
I want you to look at pretty mid, and I want you to understand some of the albums there with that same argument. We're talking Counting Worms and Knocked
Clearing
Loose.
Mirror. It's clearing Slipknot.
We're talking My Heroine. It actually, I feel like you've almost, with that statement, made an incredibly strong argument for why it would be homed perfectly in that sort of category.
Where?
I don't take this over Asking Alexandria. I don't. Not me personally. I can't. That album has a lot of like hard-hitting songs that just don't, it doesn't fully come together in the end, but there's a lot of good to be found.
But give me the argument over Amity. Is there like that's I'm trying to gauge where you are.
Yeah. I'm thinking Amity sort of, again, all these albums are slightly similar where it's like they've got a couple really incredible songs. They've got a few good ones, and then they've got what I think are some forgettable tracks.
Can I hit you with something?
Which is why they kind of just sort of like feel a little middling. If we were doing a ranking of songs, then weirdly I would say
GOAT.
And Then She Bled is like somehow, like, again, a masterpiece. But this album as a whole, I think this band has better albums in there. I think the follow-up to this is already
I've got a
immediately
place
better.
Directly in the middle.
I think for me it's under Knocked Loose.
That's what I meant.
Okay, that is directly in the middle. Fair.
Directly in the middle, it's number 5.
That feels good, and obviously we're talking about, a project where an artist has tragically passed away. So like, I'm not going to make light of that in any capacity. So, however, I feel pretty mad about this album. I've always felt Mitch is an incredible vocalist and frontman. To the degree too that like immense respect for Suicide Silence for being able to carry on in spite of that tragedy. Because obviously I very clearly was not an easy thing to do. Yeah. Marks, finally, we're left with Disgusting by Beartooth. It is the debut album by this American hardcore band.
Columbus, Ohio, I believe. One of the areas in Ohio. I forget what city.
Follow-up to their debut EP, Sick, continues the story of self-hatred.
Yeah, who cares? This is
came out June 10th, 2014. A decade ago in like 2 weeks.
Debut album from Caleb Shomo, fresh out of Attack.
Mm-hmm.
Where we had just gotten like This Means War. Again, we come out pretty hard with the debut EP and Sick. Fairly fast turnaround to Disgusting.
Yeah.
And now the album. I mean, there's not a whole lot more to it.
I forgot how hard this came in so early.
You forget this
the
album?
Lines, Beaten in Lips, Body Bag, In Between. That's how this fucking album starts. I was like, holy shit.
You forget this album is younger than Collapse by Dangerkids.
Wow. Good point. The thing with Beartooth is that like they're a young band, but like Caleb Shomo has been in the scene for like a minute.
Been around.
So it makes them seem like a more of like a classic act within like the metalcore scene at this point. Man, this band was so on to something so early.
It's almost so much fucking better than I remember it being, Sam. I don't know. I've always had like a weird thing with Beartooth. And I guess it really got mega started in aggressive, but even around this time when Disgusting had dropped, I liked Sick. But I was still having like some weird... I was so mad about This Means War.
I felt the same way. I was right there with you.
And then you tell me Shomo has departed that band and he's leaned into all of the things I disliked most about This Means War.
Right.
And I was seeing red. It literally meant war for me. I'm like, okay, Shomo, fuck you. You want to go be that band? Go be that band.
Right.
But it was hard to deny a lot of the strength of so many of these songs in the lines, in between, especially at the time. But now I look at the rest of this record, a decade on, and there's so much to like about so much of this album.
Sick and Disgusting, the title track is incredible. The title track-ish is incredible.
Yeah, it's still pretty fucking rough, tough to listen to.
Yeah, 100%. What's interesting is that like
hear Shomo crying in it.
we have this now foresight or hindsight provided by the fact that this newest Beartooth record is kind of like this like turn in character to positivity, which I think paints an almost like stronger like light across this record.
Yes.
Like having that context almost like gives this record more depth and meaning than it had in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like showed my hands a little bit. This one's a fucking good time.
Here's my only problem with this record.
Keep Your American Dream.
It's 2 songs. It's Keep Your American Dream.
It's definitely one of them.
And it's Dead.
Ooh, I don't know if I'm fully there with Dead.
This band did the most unforgivable thing for me, which is they made their next 2.5 albums the 2 songs I like the least on it. Like the lesson they took from this album is that they chose the 2 songs that I liked the least and made it their entire band for 7 years. It's incredible going back and seeing the precursor to everything about this band that would end up having me turn away from them completely.
And it's so
up
funny
until this last album.
Because alternatively, you also have In Between, which is very clearly like one of this band's biggest anthems, and commercially it would go on to do very well. And then this band would not be able to replicate anything like it until like Riptide came along.
Keep Your American Dream is like, it's incredible that it's like literally the template for what would be all of Aggressive and Disease. Just this constant repeating title of the track as a chorus without ever really writing in all of these incredible melodies that we have on some of the tracks on this album and that we would again see on their newest record.
You're right. It's
insane going back and seeing them make the worst of this record the future of this band for so long.
For 4 tracks, there's an argument that this is like one of the greatest albums of all time.
Right. And I would even say for 8 tracks, it's still very good. And then it just kind of tapers off for a little bit in like an incredibly frustrating way.
Until it finally finds its footing one more time.
Right. I can cut 2, maybe 3 songs from this album and have an all-time fucking classic, but not as it exists now.
Yeah, I'm in full
I have
agreement.
a problem. God damn.
You forget how good I Have a Problem was.
No, I probably remembered how good that one was, to be fair. So like, yeah, this is
how do we feel
tough.
How do we feel all these years removed about the listen to the sound of your children revolting do breakdown?
I think it was a little goofy at the time. It's still a little goofy today, but now I appreciate it a little more just because like it's somehow an aspect of like my nostalgia. Let's start here. This absolutely obliterates.
Yeah, right.
Aggressive.
Right. That it is most important to acknowledge that there's one album on here that we specifically need to establish it as better or worse than.
It cleans.
It is aggressive.
Aggressive.
Right. Which is in fucking awful.
Where do we go from there?
Meaning that is it still in fucking awful?
No.
Just above aggressive?
Of course not. Of course not.
So is it in pretty mid? I think no. I think definitely not.
Definitely not?
Pretty mid? No, I take this over Casey. I take this over the Wonder Years. Gets a little more complicated around Parkway. But I take this over anything in pretty mid. This album is like 4 or 5 tracks at the top, almost impenetrable.
Okay. Hey, I'd make that same argument. You can make that same argument for Asking. Easily.
Okay, I'll hit you with this.
First half of asking,
The worst-
this band was cooking at a fucking 3-star Michelin restaurant
Somehow,
before they
some way,
fucking ended up in Burger King.
the worst tracks off of this album are better than the worst tracks off that Asking album.
I'll give you that. I'll give you that. Is it the top of Pretty Mid? I feel like you're telling me no because you think it's better than Casey and the Wonder Years.
That's the
Minimum.
problem, is I've already said that out loud, and I do think it's a better... Like,
Okay,
especially
fine, I'll hear you
knowing
out.
what I know now, I'm never going to touch fucking... I'm probably... Again, these are all skips down at the bottom. I'm probably not really going to touch anything in Pretty Mid. There's a chance I revisit a lot in Just Okay. Am I visiting this more than the Wonder Years? Probably.
Sure, okay,
Casey,
fine.
probably.
Okay, this is personal taste.
And again,
which
like
is,
it gets
to
a
be
little
fair,
more
this whole tier
complicated.
list.
Like, I guess this is probably better than Horizons. And
I mean,
then
yeah,
Amorosa
it's
is
weird when you
probably the
start getting
first
to this
wall.
point, man. You keep putting me in this position, but I really think this Amorosa album is deeply underrated, even
So
where
you should
we
have
have
put it in
it.
fucking That Bitch instead of being a bitch every time we get to it.
You forced me.
I didn't force you anything.
This is a joint list. You forced me to put it in that position.
This list is getting fucking big, by the way.
This list is getting big. All right, fine. How far can we go? I don't think this is better than Dangerkids.
It's not.
Miss May I was a weird one for me because that's an album that I pushed into that position that
Sure,
I feel like
all right,
you
so-
thought should
so-
be higher.
So, well, let's say it's where it, I don't know. Is it better than After Laughter? Maybe that's what we have to establish.
So you're already saying it's better than Amorosa. You're there at least.
No, I'm. If we're going down the list, if we just said it's worse than Miss May, I don't know. I don't know here, bro.
This is a tricky
I'm a little
one.
stumped.
Yeah, this is tricky. All right, so we know it's not getting further than Dangerkids. Lock it in. But
Okay.
where in that little jumble of albums does it actually belong?
If we're going off like just generally talking about
Just generally. Talk about it.
no, well, I mean like if at some point we lock in a tier and an album it can't sink any lower or any higher than, then I do think there is value in saying like, okay, am I going to revisit this more or less than After Laughter? Like, is that a
God.
discussion?
I mean, if you're starting to make that argument, I think... Fuck.
Because realistically, like if you look up and down this tier list, Sempiternal's the GOAT because that is the album I am most likely to spend the most amount of time with for the rest of my life, right?
Sure, I'm kind of with you.
Maybe not.
Like, I sort of see where you're coming from. I don't hate it where it is. I do like it more than the Miss May I album. Amorosa and Paramore are such a weird couple of albums because they're like...
Do we take the opportunity to separate them?
There's such insane highs on those records and otherwise pretty good material.
Yeah. I mean, that's all of Just Okay, right?
It's not, I guess, a terrible way to frame Miss May I either, though again, you're fonder of that one than me, which is why I put Beartooth over it. Here's what I'm thinking. Beartooth
well, so
is
if that's
either
the case,
here
then I put it under it.
or here. That's
So
where I
fucking
stand.
dumb.
It's either here
Lock it in
or here. Which one?
wherever you want. I think we separate Amorosa and Paramore.
You think it's this fucking weird middle ground? That just looks stupid.
Yeah, it does look a little.
It just looks weirdly stupid. So once again, it either just manages to not clean these records or just manages to clean them.
Yeah, fuck it. It's not clearing them.
All right. There you have it. We'll be back next week with another episode of Ranking the Scene. Once again, if you want to submit an album, patreon.com/SOTS podcast. Thumbs up if you enjoyed the show. Comment if you agree or disagree with our rankings.
I'm worried about this one.
Other shit probably in the description of this episode. Love you guys. Bye.
Good.